Wow. What do you say about that? Arguably the greatest of all time. If you don't consider him number one, surely you consider him two, if not three, tops. You can make a very strong case that he is the greatest of all time. Coming on the show and for 30 minutes laying it out, as he has been known to do over the last few years, turning into one of the more riveting and fascinating interviews in our sport. George St. Pierre telling the world that he is now a free agent. That according to his lawyer, James Quinn of New York, the UFC is in breach of their contract. They were given a 2-week sort of deadline. Came back with a fight against Robbie Lawler. Nothing more. Nothing more was addressed. Close as far as negotiations were concerned with Lorenzo Fertitta. And then the new ownership group came in, and for whatever reason, it dissolved. Now, of course, important to remember, two sides to every story. Often there are 3 and 4. Our team has reached out to the UFC. You want to get their thoughts on it? You have to get their thoughts on it. That's the only fair thing to do. And curious to hear what they have to say about this. But hopefully, and maybe it won't happen, but hopefully this can put to rest the notion that GSP didn't want to fight, that he was stringing us along, that he was stringing along sponsors. This, to me, sounded like a man who wanted to fight. This, to me, sounded like a man who was very disappointed that he won't be fighting on December 10th in front of his fellow Canadians. This, to me, sounded like a man who was somewhat, bummed out by the whole process and wanted to go on vacation to forget about it all. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's dead. Doesn't necessarily mean that his career is over. Doesn't necessarily mean that his UFC career is over. I think George did a great job of keeping that door open by not pouring salt on any wounds, by not burning any bridges. But clearly, as of right now, there's nothing to show for it. Negotiations have failed, and according to his legal team, he's a free man. And this is something, not too different. Chael went about it a different way, but Chael's situation wasn't the same. But of course, out of left field, he's a free agent and he signs with Bellator. The times, they are changing, my friends. The sport is evolving in front of our eyes. As I've been saying time and again, a lot of things are changing, have changed, will change. Speaking of which, what you follow people on Twitter, you hear from enough things. I think our own Dave Meltzer spoke about it. There are a lot of people in Las Vegas at Zuffa HQ who are worried about the state of their jobs. Anyone who believed that a new ownership group would come in, buy the company for that much money, and just keep it status quo, you were fooling yourself. Same thing that happened with Strikeforce when they were purchased by Zuffa. Same thing that happens in every business across the world when there's a takeover of sorts, when it's bought out. And many people are believing that that time may be coming this week, that there are a lot of layoffs coming, that there are a lot of duplicate jobs. And from what I've been told from countless sources, now people want to speak, that the morale there isn't great, that something needs to be done soon. People need to know the fate of their jobs. All this to say that a lot is changing, and that is to be expected. And that's not necessarily a knock on the new ownership. They buy it, they want to change it, they can't change it overnight. These things take time, especially when you're talking about, a multi-million-dollar industry, billion-dollar industry. These things take time. Of course, for the families, the fathers, the mothers who are providing for their families, they want things to happen right away. They want to know the fate of their jobs. It's unfortunate. So this will affect the employees who we often forget about. There are, I think, 300 or so people who work for Zuffa across the world. And this will affect the fighters as well. And you saw it right there. George St. Pierre saying that with Lorenzo it was close, new ownership group comes in, it ain't close anymore. And you wonder why Weidman was able to sit down with Lorenzo Fertitta and he was used as some kind of mediator and this wasn't done with George. You wonder. A fascinating story to add to what has been the most newsworthy year in the history of this sport. And guess what? There's still 2.5 months left. There's still MSG. There's still the return of Ronda Rousey. What happens to that Toronto card now? Does it just remain intact? Do they add another big fight, a title fight? Who knows? But the times they are changing, and it is a fascinating time to cover the sport. And again, I thank very much George St. Pierre and his team for coming on the show and breaking that news and giving us some kind of update from his perspective. Now the ball goes back into the UFC's court, and we want to hear what they have to say. And hopefully it can be done in a professional and truthful manner, and we could get the real story about what's going on. I always thought, look, he just told us since February they had been negotiating. There were talks. To imply that there was no interest, to me, was a little disingenuous. I don't think that. I know sometimes you have to protect your interest, and that's the way things go in sports, in the public eye. Personally, would have done it a different way. Let's bring in New York Rick here, get his perspective on what has been going on, get his perspective on the GSP story. Mr. New York Rick, are you there?
I'm here.
Your immediate reaction. Now, you have been hounding me. You have been almost harassing me about this GSP news. I mean, I kept you in the dark, and I had to. I had to.
Did you?
I mean, you're Loose Lips McGee over there. Your immediate reaction to what he had to say to this news?
Tempered, because we don't know the other side of it. We don't know. So he declared himself a free agent, but we don't know what that actually means. There's still much to be seen here. That said, this is not something that would have happened, any other time. So it's the biggest, possible news for every other organization out there. Because let's assume that GSP is still under contract and he's not a free agent. There is some kind of binding agreement or something like that. I don't know if he doesn't want to fight for the organization, at least as far as what I can tell from what he's saying. They likely would want him, but he wouldn't, probably be the ideal employee. So everybody else in the game has to be kind of licking their lips.
It's funny they use the word employee, by the way, as that has been a hot topic. And I know what you mean when you say that. But here's an important thing to remember, and I get your tempered response. This is not a guy who woke up this morning and said, you know what, I'm a free agent today. This is a guy who went and look up James Quinn, as I did as he was talking. Look up who he represents. Look up his history. These lawyers don't get paid a lot of money to, make decisions that aren't based in fact. And
also what we know about GSP is he's very measured. He's not going to come out and just say something that likely cannot be backed up. So
trust me, I've been trying to get him on the show for quite some time.
I think that ultimately what we are leading to is GSP being a completely free agent and being fair game for other organizations. Now, at the end, he did say he lost a bit of that fire.
Yeah, that is
to fight, which is interesting, because you would think that when you're on the verge of free agency and when the market's going to be open for you, you should be talking about how the fire's still there and you want to be,
But you can understand why he's a little defeated, a little deflated.
It's the ultimate honesty. He's being completely honest. He's run down. He's tired. This back and forth has gotten him tired. But it's interesting if you're another organization to look at it and say, I don't want to hear that he lost his fire. I want to hear that I'm getting the very best GSP that we've ever had. And I think that the time off from actually fighting, even though I know he's training, will ultimately he'll probably be in a pretty good place physically when he does or does not decide to come back. But if he does, this is huge news, and it's going to be a whole new ballgame.
Okay, now let me ask you this, because another interesting thing that he said was the UFC claimed that they believe they have to reintroduce him to the audience. How much value, in your opinion, does George St. Pierre have in October of 2016? In other words, if you're Bellator or any other organization, are you essentially giving him a blank check because he redefines your organization? He now all of a sudden gives you a brand new identity because he is arguably the greatest of all time and still very much in his prime.
I think it's very difficult to kind of measure this just because this is new. This is not something that's happened before. Now,
but do you think GSP still holds, that respect? Do people still want to see him fight?
I do, but I also think that the promotion, the organization matters in this equation. It's not as simple as does GSP still have the juice? It's does GSP still have the juice, and can that organization squeeze every bit of it out of him? Because I don't know that there's somebody out there that could leverage GSP the same way that the UFC could to make it worthwhile. Now, again, we don't know what kind of numbers he's talking about. It seemed like he's saying it's not 10 million and that it's lower than that, but we don't know what this actual number is that he would need to fight. I don't think there's enough of a track record to really say at this point. This would be uncharted territory, as he said several times. In fact, he used that terminology a lot about it being uncharted territory.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's enough evidence to say this superstar is established. We've got him, possibly the best ever, and now we're transporting him to another organization. Will people tune in? I don't know. It's never been done, so I don't know.
Well, I'll say this. I mean, of course, the first thought has to be Bellator, right? They are the number 2.
Yep.
They have the deepest pockets. They're owned by Viacom. They have been very active this year in free agency. If Bellator signed George St. Pierre, and when you consider the fact that they also have signed, could you imagine? I mean, what the heck? 2016, they also have Roy McDonald.
Yeah.
They signed George St. Pierre and bring him, and they don't even need it, but if they do bring Roy, they can go to the Bell Center. They can go to the Air Canada Center in Toronto, Bell Center in Montreal. They can go to Rogers Place in Vancouver. They can go to any major arena in the Great White North, the hockey arenas, the 20,000-seat arenas, and sell it out, I think, in minutes.
Yeah.
They cannot do that with any fighter on their card, past or present, current, future. They have the key to that market if they sign George St. Pierre.
Absolutely.
And no other fighter, in my opinion, right now, as far as a potential free agent, of course, Conor is the key to the world, Ronda, but no other fighter who is close to free agency or possibly a free agent can do that for Bellator or any other organization. If they put a card with George St. Pierre only, forget Rory, forget stacking the deck the rest of the way. If it's the return of GSP, the Bell Center, which once held around 24,000, I think, for UFC 124, GSP Koscheck 2, is sold out in minutes, in my opinion. That's a big deal.
Yeah.
And that is massive.
It is. I mean, it depends. Obviously, it depends on the price that he would need, but there's no question that his fans will travel. It's just what does that mean?
But they don't even travel. Like, you're going to Montreal, that's his hometown.
Okay.
You know what I'm saying?
His fans will show up, is what I meant, not travel. But it also, how does this impact the TV product? Do you completely, revamp the organization and focus on GSP? There's so much fallout. There's so much impact that this would potentially have, that it's an incredibly incredibly uncharted. This experiment, if it were to come true, if it were to come to fruition, is going to be absolutely gripping. Everybody's going to tune in for that and see. I think it will be very impactful in the future of how this type of thing goes. It will be a trendsetter once again.
Sure, and not 100% uncharted in the sense that Randy Couture had a situation with the UFC where they went to court and it didn't end up well for him. I do believe that, look, a very good tweet here from Matt Brown, not the fighter, a longtime MMA journalist, now no longer works in the sport, but still works in media. George St. Pierre's attorney, James Quinn, has been the lead on cases involving NBA and NFL players re-free agency, knows the space well. Again, he's not like, I know his team, I know his managers, I know the guys behind him. They don't speak out of turn. Mm-hmm. And of course, I'm not saying that the UFC is not going to have something to say. I'm not saying that this is going to be like a walk in the park and he's going to be fighting, on Spike tomorrow. But if they're coming out and saying this, I feel pretty good that they've done their due diligence, and maybe it's a little different than the Randy Couture situation in that regard. But
also, I think the landscape is different. These megastars are much more important now. At the time, that it was Randy Couture, it felt like there were more stars, but they had less individual impact, if that makes sense. There were more stars, there were more names, there were more faces in MMA, but the sport wasn't as driven by one individual fighter in the same way it is now, with the Conor McGregor and Ronda Rousey, and now potentially GSP, if that still remains the case, where their importance is elevated to an incredible degree, and I think. I don't think there's anything like this. I really don't.
Two other thoughts. I think a lot of people were thinking when WME-IMG and the group of investors bought the UFC for $4 billion, they're like, oh, wow, now we're going to make it. And it was a very interesting thing because finally a number had been attached to the sport. Mm-hmm. I think that they're actually going to try to recoup that money in the sense of cutting back shows, which is the word, doing less internationally, not paying for big name free agents, letting people like Chael and maybe a GSP walk away. So, they got to get the money back. They got to get into the black. They don't want to be in the red. And that is a big investment with a big loan. There's a lot of money at stake here. And I think that's very interesting. I also think it's interesting that, this idea that, okay, George St. Pierre last fought in 2011, when was it? When was UFC 167? Was it 2013? Signed a contract in 2011. I believe he has like 4 fights left. This idea that, okay, if you don't fight, your contract gets frozen. I don't know how fair that is, A, and B, especially when the landscape of the particular promotion that the contract is tied to completely changes. Reebok, no sponsorships, USADA, TV deals. It can't be frozen for one side and not for the other. GSP was allowed to wear any sponsor he wanted. He was allowed, and that's why he signed that deal, because he could do this and that. But then to come back and say, okay, we're going to still pay you this amount, but you can't do these other things, it doesn't really work. You know what I mean? And I think this is also being brought to light as the sport continues to change. Guys are taking breaks and coming back into this new world. Fascinating time. Unbelievable. And Conor has done a lot here in terms of bringing this stuff to the forefront, having this be a part of the discussion. Guys becoming a lot more financially conscious. I don't think it has anything to do with the GSP situation, but it is literally evolving in front of our eyes. The sport is changing in front of our eyes. It will not look the same next year. It will not look the same in 6 months. Behind the scenes, in front of the camera. I mean, just look at who's fighting for Bellator now. Could you have ever... I was looking at a picture. I was looking through our gallery. I was looking at a picture of... I was trying to find a picture for George St. Pierre. And I was looking at the media workouts from UFC 167. At the media workouts for UFC 167 was Chael Sonnen, Rory McDonald, Hoist Gracie, George St. Pierre. I was like, who would have ever? Lineup. Yeah, I was like, who ever thought that we would get to this point? Unbelievable.
Now, let's assume. I think this is an interesting question. Let's assume that GSP still has as much drawing power as we think he does. Now, I'm too far inside the MMA bubble to really be able to objectively think about it, but I think GSP has tremendous drawing power.
Yes.
Let's assume that's correct.
Yes.
Does he need to sign with an organization, or does he do his own thing? Yeah. If he has as much juice as we think, he could be potentially doing his own thing, and that would be unprecedented as well.
Yes. Funny you bring that up. I tweeted this on Saturday. There was an article on themaclife.com, one of my favorite websites, where they were talking about Charlie Ward, not the quarterback, not the Heisman Trophy winner, not the former point guard of the New York Knicks. I was just waiting for all those jokes to roll in. Same spelling, but teammate, friend of Conor McGregor's at SBG Ireland, signing with UFC, fighting Randy Brown on December 9th in Albany. And they were talking about how Team McGregor is happy and we're bringing in another guy and interesting times for McGregor Inc. and all this stuff. And you go back to that interview where I sat down with Conor prior to 189, when he talked about all this stuff, about kind of being his own promoter and all that. That is the boxing model. And you wonder, with all this stuff happening, if this is going to happen as well in our sport. And I don't know if that is necessarily good, in the sense that, okay, we look at it from a fan perspective. We always like the UFC because all the best were fighting under one umbrella. If things get splintered from a clean, easy way to follow the sport, it changes. But I think from a revenue sharing standpoint, that is a very good thing for the fighters. They get a bigger piece of the pie.
Yeah, and I think there's very few who could kind of lead that charge, but GSP...
Yeah, could you imagine?
Seems like one of them. And he also, one of the things that, there was so much that he said in that interview, but he also touched on the fact that himself, Conor McGregor, Anderson Silva, Jose Aldo, guys like that need to be leading the charge.
Sure.
About taking care of other fighters and making sure that they're properly compensated. He mentioned Bisping's compensation. It seems like all of these things are on his mind at the very least. In terms of figuring out a way for fighters to be taken care of. So I don't know. He said so much, but it's going to be, I think this will be the story of... Wow. In a long line of stories in 2016. What's your prediction? Do we ever see GSP fight again? I have to think so. Wow. Why? Right. Well, why declare your free agency if you don't need? I know you want that card in your back pocket. You want the leverage. You want the ability to do it. But if you weren't really planning on pursuing it, yeah, you might just let it fall. Why put yourself through all the hassle? Why go through the effort?
Yeah.
I think he's thinking about it, and that should be enough. And a guy it's not. George left as a champion. George left as probably one of the best ever, if not the best. You got to think he's looking for a challenge, and yeah, he's under no obligation to make himself a free agent. So I think that almost says it all.
Yeah, I mean, very interesting to sort of declare yourself a free agent in the sense that, like, Carmelo Anthony, we knew that his contract was up 2 years ago. He doesn't sign any offers. Okay, I'm going to test the market here. You really want to hear what the other side has to say about this.
Yeah.
The sport is so different. And so we await that word. And we see what happens. Massive stuff from GSP.